Und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen!
In the shadowy depths of a bunker, as the Third Reich teetered on the brink of collapse, a meeting unfolded that would encapsulate the desperation of a crumbling empire.
Von allem Anfang an bin ich so verraten und betrogen worden.
How did Hitler and Göring react when General Heinrici, the harbinger of doom, declared the end was near? The prelude to the end. Background information leading up to the meeting. As 1945 dawned, the Axis powers found themselves ensnared in a vice grip of their own making. The Third Reich, once the formidable behemoth of Europe, was now gasping for breath under the relentless advance of the Allied forces. The Eastern Front, in particular, had become a symbol of German desperation as Soviet troops, emboldened by victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, pushed westward with an inexorable force. General Gotthard Heinrici, a name perhaps not as infamous as others in the Nazi military elite, was nonetheless a figure of significant importance during these waning days of the war. Known for his defensive expertise, Heinrici was tasked with the impossible: to hold the Vistula River line and later the Oder River, the last major natural barrier before Berlin. His appointment came at a time when German military leadership was in disarray, with Hitler increasingly detached from reality, issuing orders for counterattacks with divisions that no longer existed. The strategic situation facing Germany in early 1945 was dire. To the east, the Red Army was poised to launch its final offensive towards Berlin, amassing forces and materiel for a decisive blow. The Western Allies, having breached the Siegfried Line, were advancing into the heart of Germany from the Rhine. Amidst this, the German High Command was riddled with infighting and disillusionment, as the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. The leadership of the Third Reich, ensconced in the Führerbunker in Berlin, was a mix of unwavering loyalty, denial, and opportunism. Hitler, increasingly ill and erratic, clung to fantastical hopes of turning the tide. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, was similarly entrenched in delusion, believing in the Luftwaffe's capacity to impact the war's outcome despite its decimation. Heinrici, on the other hand, was a realist. He understood the futility of further resistance and the catastrophic loss of life that would ensue from defending Berlin to the last. As the Soviet forces prepared for their onslaught, the German defensive lines were stretched thin. Heinrici, despite his acumen, was handicapped by the lack of resources and the deteriorating quality of the troops under his command. The units that once might have held the line were now composed of old men and young boys, ill-equipped and poorly trained, a stark testament to the desperation of the German situation. In these desperate times, the meeting between Heinrici, Hitler, and Göring was convened. It was not just a military briefing, but a collision of realities. The delusional optimism of Hitler and Göring against the stark, unyielding realism of Heinrici. This meeting was not merely about strategizing the defense of Berlin, but confronting the end of an era, the collapse of a regime that had plunged the world into darkness. Heinrici, the reluctant messenger. In the twilight of the Third Reich, as shadows gathered over Berlin, General Gotthard Heinrici stood out not for his allegiance to the Nazi ideology, but for his renowned defensive military strategies. A soldier, Heinrici was thrust into a position that required him to navigate not only the challenges of a collapsing front, but also the treacherous waters of a Nazi leadership disconnected from reality. His story is one of pragmatism amidst fanaticism, of a commander who saw clearly the end that others refused to acknowledge. Heinrici's military career was distinguished by his expertise in defensive tactics. Unlike many of his contemporaries who reveled in the blitzkrieg tactics that had initially brought success to the Wehrmacht, Heinrici was a proponent of meticulously planned defenses, understanding the strategic value of conserving forces for decisive moments. This approach made him one of the most competent generals of the Wehrmacht, especially in situations that demanded the fortification of positions under threat. His philosophy was simple yet profound. Victory was not always about advancing, but sometimes about holding the line with the least possible loss of life. This belief was rooted in his experiences in World War I, where he witnessed the futility of frontal assaults against well-entrenched enemies. Heinrici's approach to warfare was, therefore, characterized by a humane aspect, focusing on the preservation of his soldiers' lives, a stark contrast to the disregard for human life exhibited by many Nazi officials. As the Red Army's noose tightened around Germany, Heinrici was appointed to command the Army Group Vistula, tasked with defending the Oder River line, the last major natural barrier before Berlin. This appointment came at a critical time when the Third Reich's military leadership was in chaos, with Hitler making increasingly irrational decisions based on delusion rather than strategic insight. Heinrici was chosen for this daunting task not out of favor. Indeed, he was not among Hitler's favored generals, but out of sheer necessity. His defensive genius was the Wehrmacht's last hope against the Soviet juggernaut. The leadership, in its desperation, turned to Heinrici, hoping his skills could stem the tide, even if just for a while. Heinrici's reluctance was not in taking command. It was in the role he had to play as the bearer of bad news. He was well aware of the catastrophic situation facing Germany, but he also knew that his realistic assessment would not be welcomed by Hitler or Goering. Both were living in a fantasy, believing in miraculous turnarounds and the invincibility of the German spirit, even as the Reich crumbled. His realistic outlook made the impending meeting with Hitler and Goering a daunting prospect. Heinrici was not just a military commander reporting on the front. He was a messenger of reality to a leadership ensconced in delusion. This role was antithetical to his nature. As a soldier, he was accustomed to direct action, not the delicate task of navigating the egos and fantasies of Nazi leaders. The meeting in the bunker was, for Heinrici, not just about military strategy, but about confronting the delusions of a regime that refused to see the writing on the wall. His task was to communicate the dire situation clearly and forcefully, to pierce the bubble of unreality that had enveloped Hitler and Göring. He had to make them understand that not only was the war lost, but continuing to fight would result in unnecessary slaughter. Heinrici's challenge was monumental. How do you convince those who have built their identities on myths of invincibility that they are, in fact, vulnerable? How do you argue for surrender and preservation of life when faced with leaders who would rather see their country in ruins than admit defeat? Inside the Führer bunker. Beneath the churning, war-torn streets of Berlin lay the Führer bunker, a subterranean labyrinth that served as the last command post of the Third Reich. This bunker, a place of stark contrasts and haunting shadows, was the setting for one of the most pivotal meetings of World War II, a meeting that would starkly illustrate the chasm between delusion and reality as the Reich teetered on the brink of collapse. The Führer bunker was not just a shelter, but a fortress, designed to withstand the most ferocious assaults. Its walls, thick with reinforced concrete, promised safety against bombs and shells, a silent testament to the fears of those it protected. The bunker consisted of 2 levels, with the lower level serving as Hitler's personal quarters. These quarters were sparsely furnished, a stark reminder of the desperate circumstances outside its confines. As one descended into the bunker, the air grew stale, and the claustrophobic weight of the earth above pressed down. The bunker was a maze of corridors and rooms, each serving a specific purpose, from planning spaces filled with maps and communication equipment to personal living quarters for the Nazi leadership. Despite its functionality, the bunker was a place of eerie silence, broken only by the muffled sounds of war and the tense whispers of its inhabitants. The atmosphere inside the Führer bunker was one of palpable tension and foreboding. As the Red Army encircled Berlin, the bunker became not just a military headquarters but a refuge for the most senior figures of the Nazi regime. It was a world removed from the chaos above, yet it could not escape the sense of impending doom that permeated its walls. Lights flickered in the dim corridors, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of the end. The air was heavy with the scent of fear and the ghostly presence of those who had passed through its halls, leaving behind decisions that had led to unparalleled destruction. In this underground fortress, the line between day and night blurred, as did the line between hope and despair. It was within this claustrophobic setting that General Heinrici was summoned to report to Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring. The meeting room was austere, with a large table dominating the space, surrounded by chairs that would soon be filled by the highest-ranking officials of the crumbling Reich. Maps adorned the walls, showing the encroaching fronts, each inch of lost territory a testament to the disintegrating dream of the Third Reich. As Heinrici entered, the room was charged with an air of expectancy. The generals and Nazi officials present were a mix of unwavering loyalty and silent despair, their faces etched with the strain of prolonged conflict and the dawning realization of their fate. The bunker, for all its physical protection, offered no shield against the truth Heinrici was about to deliver. In this underground chamber, far removed from the reality of the battlefields, the contrasts could not have been starker. On one side stood Heinrici, the realist, prepared to deliver a sober assessment of the situation. On the other, Hitler and Göring, entrenched in their delusions of victory, awaited reports that would align with their fantasies. The meeting begins. The atmosphere in the Führer bunker's cramped meeting room was charged with an electric sense of urgency as General Gotthard Heinrici prepared to deliver his report. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of impending doom that seemed to seep into the very walls of the bunker. The high-ranking officials of the Nazi regime, including Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, sat in grim anticipation, their faces a mix of anxiety and defiance. The room, lit by the harsh glare of artificial light, cast long shadows over maps and documents, setting a somber stage for the proceedings. As Heinrici stood before the assembled Nazi leadership, there was a palpable shift in the room. His presence, that of a seasoned general known for his defensive acumen, brought a momentary sense of reality into the otherwise detached environment of the bunker. However, the initial reactions from Hitler and Göring were marked by an eerie calm, a facade maintained to uphold the illusion of control amidst the chaos. Hitler, whose health and demeanor had visibly deteriorated over the months, attempted to project an aura of unwavering confidence. His eyes, though clouded by illness and defeat, tried to pierce through the veneer of the situation, seeking any glimmer of hope or victory. Göring, ever the opportunist, masked his concern with bravado, ready to latch onto any suggestion of a possible turnaround, despite the evident futility of their situation. As Heinrici began his report, the room's atmosphere tensed further. His voice, steady and devoid of any false hope, resonated against the bunker's walls, delivering a stark contrast to the delusional optimism that had characterized the leadership's stance. Heinrici's detailed account of the situation on the front lines, the overwhelming Soviet forces, the dire state of German defenses, and the clear impossibility of halting the Red Army's advance, was a cold shower on the flickering flames of fantasy that had kept the Nazi leadership's spirits artificially buoyed. The generals and officials present exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mixture of fear, denial, and in some cases, a dawning realization of the inevitable. The reality of Heinrici's words clashed violently with their entrenched beliefs in a final decisive victory that would miraculously reverse the fortunes of war. As the report continued, detailing the shortcomings in manpower, equipment, and morale, the bunker's claustrophobic confines seemed to constrict even further. Hitler's initial calm facade began to crack, his reactions shifting from silent contemplation to agitated denial. Göring, meanwhile, struggled to maintain his composure, his mind likely racing to consider the implications of Heinrici's assessment on his own ambitions and fate. The atmosphere became a crucible for a collision of realities. The undeniable truth of Germany's precarious position, as laid bare by Heinrici, against the fantastical hopes of a regime too entrenched in its own propaganda to face the grim prospects of defeat. This was not just a briefing, it was a confrontation between the harsh light of truth and the darkness of denial that had enveloped the highest echelons of the Nazi leadership. Hitler's delusion versus Heinrici's realism. As World War II reached its twilight, the stark contrast between Adolf Hitler's delusional optimism and General Gotthard Heinrici's grounded realism became a defining feature of the Nazi regime's final days. This divergence was not merely a clash of personalities, but a reflection of fundamentally different understandings of the war's reality. Adolf Hitler's optimism in the face of impending defeat was rooted in a complex mix of ideological fervor, personal ego, and a profound detachment from the war's realities. Hitler's leadership style had always been characterized by a reliance on bold, often reckless decision-making buoyed by early successes in the war. However, as the tide turned against the Third Reich, his strategies became increasingly untethered from military feasibility, driven instead by a belief in the German people's will and destiny to prevail against all odds. This delusional optimism was further fueled by Hitler's surrounding entourage, who, either out of fear or ambition, fed him only the information that supported his worldview. In the claustrophobic confines of the Führer bunker, isolated from the front line's grim realities, Hitler's perspective became increasingly myopic. He clung to the belief that victory could be snatched from the jaws of defeat through sheer willpower and the supposed inferiority of his enemies, ignoring the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In stark contrast, General Gotthard Heinrici's approach was defined by a clear-eyed realism honed through years of military service. Heinrici understood the strategic and logistical limitations facing the Wehrmacht in the final stages of the war. His assessments were based on hard evidence and first-hand knowledge of the front line's conditions, recognizing the impossibility of reversing the Soviet advance with the resources at his disposal. Heinrici's realism was not born of defeatism, but of a pragmatic understanding of military strategy and a deep concern for the welfare of his soldiers. Unlike Hitler, who seemed willing to sacrifice countless lives for an increasingly unattainable victory, Heinrici sought to minimize German casualties, advocating for strategic withdrawals and defensive postures that would preserve his forces for more critical engagements. The meeting in the Führer bunker between Hitler and Heinrici brought these two contrasting perspectives into sharp relief. As Heinrici presented his unvarnished assessment of the situation, highlighting the dire shortages of men, material, and morale, Hitler's reactions ranged from disbelief to outright denial. Hitler's responses were characterized by an insistence on offensive strategies that had no basis in reality, reflecting a refusal to accept the strategic landscape's transformation. This divergence can be attributed to several factors. Hitler's perspective was shaped by a combination of ideological commitment to the notion of a final victory and a personal inability to confront the possibility of defeat. His leadership had become characterized by an echo chamber effect, where dissenting voices were silenced and unrealistic expectations were amplified. Göring's role and responses. Hermann Göring, once the designated successor to Adolf Hitler and a figure of immense power within the Nazi regime, found himself in a precarious position as the Third Reich faced its inevitable downfall. His involvement and responses during the critical meeting with General Gotthard Heinrici in the Führer bunker highlight the complexities and contradictions of his character, as well as the broader dysfunctions within the Nazi leadership as they grappled with the reality of defeat. Göring's reputation was inextricably linked to the Luftwaffe, the air force that had once been the pride of Nazi Germany. Early in the war, the Luftwaffe played a pivotal role in the blitzkrieg tactics that secured rapid victories across Europe. However, by 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, hamstrung by resource shortages, strategic missteps, and the Allies' growing air superiority. Göring, despite his bombastic personality and penchant for grandiose promises, could no longer mask the Luftwaffe's ineffectiveness. During the meeting, Göring's role was emblematic of his broader approach throughout the war, offering optimistic promises that were increasingly disconnected from reality. As Heinrici outlined the dire situation on the Eastern Front, emphasizing the Soviet Union's overwhelming force and the German army's critical shortages, Göring interjected with assurances of air support and reinforcements that were both unrealistic and unfeasible. These promises reflected a dual motive: an attempt to maintain his standing in Hitler's inner circle and a desperate bid to assert some semblance of control over the collapsing situation. Göring's responses were characterized by a blend of denial and wishful thinking, a hallmark of the Nazi leadership's final months. His assurances to Heinrici were less about practical military support and more about perpetuating the myth of an eventual turnaround, even as the reality of defeat became undeniable. Göring's reaction to Heinrici's stark realism was one of discomfort and, at times, outright hostility. Heinrici's unvarnished presentation of the facts, devoid of any sugarcoating, threatened the narrative that Göring and others in the bunker sought to maintain. As Heinrici pushed back against Göring's unfounded optimism, the tension in the room escalated. Göring, accustomed to deference and adulation, found himself challenged by a reality he was ill-prepared to accept. This dynamic underscored a critical fault line within the Nazi leadership, the chasm between those who clung to delusional hopes of victory and those, like Heinrici, who confronted the sobering truth of their circumstances. Göring's reactions throughout the meeting were emblematic of a leadership in denial, unable or unwilling to reckon with the consequences of their actions. The clash of ideals, the meeting as a microcosm. The meeting between General Gotthard Heinrici and the Nazi leadership, including Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, in the claustrophobic confines of the Führerbunker, was more than just a military briefing. It represented the fundamental clash between the fantastical ideals of the Nazi regime and the harsh military reality facing Germany in the final days of World War II. This confrontation of ideals was not merely about differing strategic perspectives, but underscored the existential crisis that had engulfed a regime built on grandiose visions of invincibility and racial supremacy. The Nazi regime had long been steeped in a culture of myth-making, where the sheer force of will and the belief in the Aryan race's destiny were seen as decisive factors in achieving victory against any odds. This worldview was not confined to the political arena, but extended into the military strategy, where Hitler, in particular, believed that ideological commitment could overcome material shortages and strategic setbacks. The leadership's fantasies were sustained by a relentless propaganda machine that portrayed the war as a heroic struggle, further detaching the regime from the realities on the ground. By contrast, the military reality, as presented by Heinrici, was one of severe attrition, with the Wehrmacht stretched to its breaking point. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of the Soviet advance, while the Western Allies pressed from the other side, tightening the noose around Germany. Heinrici's report laid bare the stark truth. The German army was no longer capable of offensive operations and was struggling even to hold defensive positions. This reality was a far cry from the regime's narrative of an impending Endsieg, final victory, highlighting the chasm between belief and fact. The meeting in the Führerbunker was a collision of these two worlds. On one side stood Heinrici, embodying the pragmatic and professional military ethos, grounded in the realities of warfare and the limits of what could be achieved under the circumstances. On the other side were Hitler and Göring, representatives of a leadership that had lost touch with reality, clinging to delusional hopes of turning the tide through sheer determination and belief in their ideological cause. This clash was not just a matter of differing opinions, but a fundamental conflict between a worldview based on fantasy and a strategic approach rooted in realism. The Nazi leadership's inability or unwillingness to confront the truth of their situation led to decisions that exacerbated the war's toll, prolonging the conflict unnecessarily and leading to countless additional deaths. The implications of this clash of ideals were profound. The meeting highlighted the dangerous consequences of leadership that divorces itself from reality, guided instead by ideology and wishful thinking. It underscored the folly of believing that unwavering faith in a cause can alter the strategic realities of warfare, particularly when those beliefs are built on a foundation of racial supremacy and nationalistic fervor.